It's me again, Shalom. I just want to come with a topic called the parallels of slavery, and let's get right into it. The history of the Israelite nation began in the land of Ham, which was ancient Egypt. Israel spent 430 years in Egypt. They entered the 70 numbered, including Joseph, known as Joseph, and his family, and left well over 1 million plus Israelites. Israel's Egyptian history began with Joseph, and his Hebrew name is Joseph, or Yosef, or whatever you want to call him. And Joseph was one of the 12 tribes. the 12 sons of Jacob. Joseph in here. He was sold into Egypt as slavery by Ishmaelite, and he was the first Israelite that was in bondage in Egypt. Had Joseph not have been sold to the Egyptians, bondage in the Israelites history, and would not have been the same as we known it today. Not let us begin to look at the undeniable parallel between the Hebrews, the first captivity in Egypt, and their last greatest captivities in the Americas. Let's start this off with prophecies of Deuteronomy chapter 28, 68 verse, which states, "And Yah shall bring you into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto you. You shall see it no more again. There you shall be sold unto your enemies, as bondwomen and bondmen and bondwomen. No man shall buy you." It means, or sell you, that or save you. I have shown how this particular curse relate to Israel and Americas. See part 3. That's what he say. Okay, but pay attention to the beginning of this verse. It's Yah shall bring Israel back into Egypt with ships. This prophecy was spoken to the Israelites as they were just leaving, freed from the physical Egyptian bondage. Israel walked out of Egypt on dry land and could have walked back on dry land, because during biblical times and before digging of the Suez Canal 1865, Israel and Egypt was one continual landmass. So why did Yah mention them going back to Egypt in ships? Simple. Yah was going to send Israel back into captivity, similar to the captivity they just left in Egypt. But this time they were going back in ships. Notice this verse, and it says Israel will be sold to their enemies. It doesn't say they would be sold to the Egyptians. This showing us that Egypt mentioned in this verse is not the physical land located in the northeast Africa, but the spiritual captivity that is reflected of the first Egyptian bondage. In part 3, Deuteronomy 28, it was noted that the scripture Egypt was a symbol of bondage to the Israelites. Egypt is called a house of bondage, and you can read Exodus 13, if y'all know these scriptures, Exodus 13 and Deuteronomy 5 and 6, 7 and 8, 26 verse. It is chapter 13 verse 3 all the way to I think chapter and 14th chapter. You read at 20 in the 4th, and that's what they said in Egypt. The iron furnace, Deuteronomy 4 and 20. That's what they said. Furnace affliction, Isaiah 48. Which all synonyms with hard slavery. Deuteronomy 28 is telling us that Israel will go into parallel Egyptian captivity in ships. This has happened to the Hebrews, blacks in the Western Hemisphere, with the coming of the transatlantic slave trade. Nowhere in the scripture does it says Deuteronomy 28 had occurred during the biblical times. That's right. So let's look at the parallels between the Hebrews first in the first captivity. Note, I start off with Joseph in Egypt because it was that Joseph that the Israelite history, Egypt began. So I will point out a few things that happened in Joseph, known as Joseph, as they were to become a symbol of things to come for his people. Joseph was sold by the Ishmaelite Arabs, dark-skinned people, to the Egyptians as slaves. Genesis 37 and 27 and 28, 39 in the chapter, then the first verse and the second verse, if y'all can read that. This is the beginning of Ishmael. This is the beginning of Yashroelites history in Egypt. Hebrews were being sold into slavery by the Arabs 1,000 years before the Europeans arrived. It was the Arabs that the first sold the Hebrews. Yeah, the Arabs sold us to Egyptians years ago. So the Arabs are Shemitic descent, and that's like they did with us. Parallels right there. Okay, to the Europeans, Portuguese. Figures on that an Arab slave trade in Africa are hard to come by, but the historian Paul Lovejoy estimates that some 90.85 million Africans, known as Hebrews — there's no such thing as an African Hebrew, that's what they call us — were shipped out as slaves to the Arabia, and small numbers to the Indian subcontinent. Lovejoy breaks his figures down as follows. Between 650 AD and 1600, an average of 5,000 Africans, known as Hebrews, the Hebrews, were shipped out by the Arabs. This makes a total of 7.25 million. Then between 1600 1800, another 1.4 million Hebrews were shipped out by Arabs. The 19th century represents the highest point of Arabian trade in Africa are hard to come by. But the historian Paul Lovejoy — I'm reading that wrong. Okay, my fault. Makes it rough. Okay. The Arabian, the trade made up to 120,000 Hebrews were shipped out of every year. The total figure for the 19th century alone was 1.2 million slaves to the Arabia, known as Saudi Arabia today. And according to Lovejoy, another 4 million Africans century of French exports in the islands and under their control in the Indian Ocean was largely conducted by Arabs, as Duncan Clark. Arabs are continued to buy and sell Hebrews into the slavery throughout the southern Sudan and other Arab countries. So yeah, the Sudanese were Hamitic and Shemitic during the time, Babylon and stuff like that. They have connections and sold us to slavery. Joseph's name was changed to Zaphenath-paneah by Pharaoh. The changing of the Hebrews, blacks, name was common practice here in Americas. That's right. That's what they did. They changed their names in America. Let me correct myself. The changing of the Hebrews' name was the norm. It was much more just common. Read any slave narrative, and the slave will tell you how his slave master changed his name. I'm not sure what the name Pharaoh gave Joseph meant, but I'm willing to bet that it was a name that was accordance with the gods of Egypt. I know for sure that many of the names were received in Americas and were according to the slave master's religion. God of Christianity, and many times were given to us according to the slave master's heritage. Joseph was thrown into jail because his slave master's wife wanted to sleep with him, but he refused. So she lied and said he tried to rape her. Genesis 39:7 and the 10, 12, whatever you want to call it. This sounds very familiar to anybody who is familiar with the Hebrews' African American history in U.S. There were many Hebrews men during slavery who were falsely accused of raping or making sexual advance toward the master's white women. Most who were accused were lynched, killed, and many were also sent to jail. Even after slavery, many Hebrew men and Hebrew towns got destroyed because a white man falsely accused them of raping her. The children of Israel had a population growth in Egypt. The Egyptians were afraid of this growth because they feared that Israel would join one of their own enemies and then come against them. Come against them. That's what they feared. It's a growing population. They didn't want to overrun this. Accused of raping her. Okay. Many Hebrew slaves and Hebrew men. Okay, I just read that. And the children of Israel had a population to grow for Pharaoh. I read that. Okay. Of their enemies to come against them. That's in Exodus chapter 7 and 9 and the 10th verse to the 12th verse. The population of the descendants of the slaves in the Western Hemisphere countries in 1950 was 48 million, the biggest success story in sheer numbers. Among the Hebrew communities of the New World was in the U.S. when the legal slave trade in Africa ended in 1808. There were about 1 million Hebrews in North America. When cattle slavery ended 1865, there were about 4.5 million, 3.5 million population increase. In 1950, there was 15 million. And in 1990, there were at least 30 and 35 million. Hebrews here, a 29 million population increase in 125 years. Wow. This population growth was not the result of any significant degree. And they said, and I'll read up above, it says they feared that Israel would join one of their enemies in coming against them. That's kind of like the Native Americans when we was in slave trade. People don't even know that. I saw that on YahsPeople.com. Any significant degree breeding by the masters, that's the population growth of any significant degree of slave breeding by the masters. The majority of slaves brought to the West were brought mainly to other Western, known as Latin America, they say, Latin America countries. North America didn't receive the majority of the slaves brought to this hemisphere. The Hebrews, so-called African Americans, population is that the result of natural growth to be considered African American, meaning you are a descendant of the slaves that were brought to North America. The American government has always been fearful of us joining onto one of its enemies and coming against them. During the Revolutionary War, the government thought our people would join forces with the British. And you know why? Just like the title of above. And they would join forces with the Indians, just like I said, Native Americans, right? Like they joined forces with the British, and they thought we would join forces with the Indians, known as Native Americans, the Japhetic people. They thought we would join forces with the communists, and so on and so on. This is why the government is fearful. Is fearful today of any kind of pro-black movement. That's right, any kind of pro-black movement. They believe, just as Pharaoh did, that we will rise up, join one of their enemies, and come against them. The government has been fearful of this. There is slavery, and even now, Egyptians put hard bondage on the Hebrews. They put taskmasters over them in the field to increase their bondage. And you know that's in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 and 14. Tells you about that. Slavery in Americas was known as a peculiar institution. It's also said to be the worst form of slavery. But slavery in the West was very hard, and the slaves worked all day and a part of the night under some very extreme conditions like malaria and things like that. I saw that on Yaz.com as well. I saw some videos on that. The ancient Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the ancient Hebrews. In the Americas, and the taskmasters were called overseers. The job both the Egyptian taskmasters and overseers were to keep the slaves in line. Both were assigned over the Hebrews in the fields. Both made the jobs of the slaves harder. They were the drivers. They pushed the slaves to the limit. The plantation overseers in the Americas were usually whites who threatened and tortured our people in order to get more work out of them. It was the taskmaster overseer who were responsible for flogging and whipping the slaves. It was the job of the taskmaster overseers to make sure the slaves finished all their work. The job of the ancient Egyptian taskmasters were the same as the overseers in America. Same thing. The Hebrews spent over 400 years in Egypt. 430 to be exact. Exodus 12 and 40. We have spent over 400 years here in America. Slaves were first brought to the hemisphere in 1500s. Slaves were in North America as early as 1521, which was over 400 years ago. Slaves were first brought to the English colony of Western Virgin in 1619. But the other colonies, such as the Spanish, already had slaves here. The Edomites, the Spaniards, and Hispanics, whatever you want to call it. According to many scholars, the Egyptologists, the Hebrews were more likely freed from bondage under the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II, the son of Seti first. I know who Seti. He was a wicked king. That was in Moses' time. Moses knew him as a father, and then Ramesses II took his place. And then he named his other son Seti II as well. Yeah, I know a lot of Egyptian history, but they worship the Son of God and all that nonsense. That's Egyptology right there. The Hebrews, the African Americans, were freed from the cattle slavery under President Abraham Lincoln. Neither Lincoln or Ramesses wanted to free the Hebrews. Pharaoh Ramesses and made for this, and then known as the Exodus, which states, and then you can go further, and it was talking about the king of Egypt and the parallels of slavery. Yeah, and they did the same thing, and yada yada yada. I know what they did. Okay, yeah, parallels of slavery. That's all I have. So with that, I want to say peace be unto you. I mean, Salakia for that. I'm going to say, peace be unto you. May Yahuwah bless you many times. All I want to say is Shalom.